He wanted a car, in his own words, that could beat the competition on the street too. This was Carroll Shelby's answer to Ferrari. Rumor had it the paint was Ferrari red, his own personal jab at the Italians. For decades, people were sure Carroll Shelby's strangest Mustang was gone for good. Not misplaced, not tucked away somewhere, destroyed. Then a small team chased a rumor to a VIN number, followed the paper trail Shelby himself had left behind, and turned up a red coupe sitting in Texas like it had stepped straight out of the 1960s. This wasn't just a rare survivor. It was a car that, by every reasonable expectation, shouldn't have made it this far at all. And once its identity was confirmed, it reshaped how collectors understood Shelby's private, experimental side. Before Carroll Shelby became one of the biggest names in American performance, he was a Texas-born racer running on instinct, grit, and a heart that was already starting to fail him. He didn't come up through corporate engineering. He came up through competition, where speed simply made sense to him. He won races because he treated machines like living things that could be pushed, tuned, broken, and rebuilt until they finally obeyed. By 1959, Shelby had pulled off something most drivers never even get close to. He won the 24 hours of Le Mans driving in Aston Martin, sharing the win with co-driver Roy Salvadori. But his body was already working against him. A heart condition forced him out of the cockpit, and for most people that would have ended the story right there. For Shelby, it was the start of a new one. If he couldn't beat Europe from behind the wheel, he'd beat it from the workshop instead. That's where the real legend begins. He looked at the lightweight British AC Ace and pictured what would happen if it were stuffed with American V8 muscle. The result was the Shelby Cobra, raw, loud, and almost rude next to the polished European sports cars it was built to embarrass. Shelby's genius wasn't subtlety, it was combination. Take European handling, add American horsepower, strip out anything unnecessary, and build something that made the old guard nervous. Worth adding here. Before any of that, Shelby had briefly tried his hand at running a chicken farm in Texas, which failed, a detail that makes his pivot into racing and car building feel less like a straight line and more like a man who kept reinventing himself until something stuck. He also raced while nursing that heart condition for years longer than doctors expected, reportedly popping nitroglycerin tablets between laps just to keep going. By the mid-1960s, Ford had a problem it couldn't fix with polite corporate memos. Ferrari was dominating endurance racing, and Henry Ford II wanted to beat them badly enough to spend a fortune trying. Ford's GT40 program had real potential, but it needed the kind of ruthless racing instinct Shelby had already proven he had. Once Shelby American took the program over, the GT40 stopped being an expensive experiment and became a weapon aimed squarely at Le Mans. The payoff was historic. Ford beat Ferrari at Le Mans in 1966, then kept winning in 1967, 1968, and 1969, a four-year streak that's still talked about as one of motorsports' great underdog stories. Shelby's role in that turnaround helped make him something bigger than a tuner or a builder. He became the man American manufacturers called when they needed speed to stop being theoretical and start being real. At the same time, Ford wanted the Mustang to earn genuine performance credibility. Lee Iacocca understood how to sell the Mustang. Shelby understood how to make it dangerous. The GT350 landed in 1965, and the GT500 followed in 1967. These weren't just trim packages, they were statements. Shelby took a mass-market pony car and gave it teeth. Worth noting, the very first GT350S weren't even fully built by Ford. Shelby's small crew in Venice, California, took brand-new Mustang fastbacks and hand-modified them, pulling the rear seats, reworking the suspension, and fitting a Weber carbureted 289, turning a relatively ordinary car into something closer to a race car with license plates. The important thing to understand is that Shelby's most interesting cars weren't always the ones that reached showrooms. The public remembers the Cobras, the GT350, the GT500, and the GT40 because those became icons. But behind every famous performance car sits a messier world of prototypes, experiments, rejected parts, test mules, and cars that were never meant to survive. In the 1960s, prototype cars had short lifespans by design. They tested engines, suspensions, brakes, or styling ideas, then got discarded, sold off quietly, or crushed outright. Nobody building them was thinking about future auction values. They were thinking about deadlines, race results, and whatever the front office wanted next. Once a test car had done its job, it could simply disappear. That's what made the story of Little Red so frustrating for so long. For decades, people assumed it had vanished because it had been destroyed, not hidden away in some private collection, not sitting quietly under a dust cover, just gone. That assumption made sense, because prototypes were routinely crushed once their work was finished. But Little Red had slipped through the cracks, and that turned it into one of the most stubborn, unsolved mysteries in Shelby's history. Little Red was a 1967 Shelby GT 500 EXP prototype, and it didn't look like the Shelby most people picture. It wasn't a fastback, it was a notchback coupe, which made it strange right out of the gate. Along with the 1968 Green Hornet, it was one of only two notchback coupes ever built to wear the Shelby name. That alone would make it valuable, but its real significance came from what it represented. Little Red was a rolling test bed, a car Ford and Shelby American used to try out ideas that could shape future performance and styling. It was tied to big block power, supercharging experiments, styling concepts, and a design path that would eventually influence the California Special Mustang. It wasn't a normal production Shelby. It was a question on wheels. How far could the Mustang be pushed? Worth adding, the car's engineering changed more than once during its working life. It started with a 390 V8, which Shelby's team later swapped for a 428 fitted with a Paxton supercharger and a top-loader 4-speed manual. Later still, it was reconfigured with a twin Paxton supercharger setup paired to a C6 3-speed automatic, meaning the car wasn't a single fixed prototype, but a moving target that kept evolving as engineers tested new ideas on it. That's exactly why its disappearance stung so much. Collectors knew it had existed. Historians had references to it. People had old photographs and secondhand memories, but the physical car was gone. For decades, the simplest explanation stuck. Ford or Shelby had sent it to the crusher like so many other prototypes. If that were true, the story ended there. But the most dangerous assumption in car history is treating a lost vehicle as dead just because the paperwork says it should be. The search for Little Red really picked up because of its sister car. Craig Jackson, chairman and CEO of Barrett-Jackson, owned the 1968 Shelby GT 500 prototype nicknamed the Green Hornet, another experimental notchback fitted with genuinely advanced features for the era: electronic fuel injection, four-wheel disc brakes, and independent rear suspension. In some ways, Green Hornet fell decades ahead of the car it was based on. While restoring and researching Green Hornet, Jackson and restoration specialist Jason Billups started talking seriously about whether Little Red might still exist somewhere too. It sounded far-fetched. Collectors had searched for years, and most experts assumed it had been crushed, stolen, wrecked, or simply lost beyond any hope of recovery. Billups believed there might still be a trail worth following. That's the point where this story becomes more interesting than any fictional secret garage version. The mystery wasn't solved by someone dramatically pulling a cover off a hidden car. It was solved through research, old paperwork, cross-reference records, and a willingness to look at the problem differently. Everyone had been chasing Little Red using its Shelby serial number, and that trail kept going cold. Billups and the team eventually realized they needed to track the car by its original Ford VIN instead. That was the real breakthrough. The car effectively had two identities: the Shelby identity everyone had been searching under, and the original Ford identity buried beneath it. Once the team started following the Ford VIN trail instead of relying only on the Shelby serial number, the dead end finally opened up. The VIN led them through old records, registrations, and ownership history, eventually pointing toward Texas. Here's the real twist. The car nobody could find wasn't hidden because no one looked. It was hidden because everyone was searching under the wrong name. In collector car history, identity is everything. A badge can make a car famous. A VIN can make it real. Little Red had fallen into the gap between those two truths for half a century. On March 3, 2018, the team located the car in rural North Texas, where it had reportedly been sitting on the same property, under the same owner, for more than 2 decades. It wasn't displayed like a museum piece. It was rough, weathered, incomplete, and easy to dismiss if you didn't know exactly what you were looking at. The engine and transmission were gone. The front fenders and hood were missing along with other body panels. To most people, it would have looked like just another tired old Mustang shell sitting among other derelict cars. To the people who understood the VIN and the clues behind it, it was the Holy Grail. The image is almost too perfect. A car built at the height of Shelby's Ford era, presumed destroyed for half a century, sitting quietly in a Texas field, waiting for someone to ask the right question. That setting matters because it strips away the fantasy. Little Red wasn't preserved by ideal conditions. It survived through accident, neglect, and misunderstanding, passed along to owners who likely never fully grasped what they had, then stored, moved, partially stripped, and left behind. That makes its survival more remarkable, not less. A prototype is especially vulnerable because it doesn't get the usual protection collectors give to production cars. If nobody recognizes what it is, it can get parted out for scrap. If the paperwork is confusing, it gets ignored. If the body looks ordinary enough, it gets mistaken for something far less significant. Little Red survived simply because no one destroyed it at the moment that would have mattered. Once Craig Jackson, Jason Billups, and respected Mustang historian Kevin Marty authenticated the car, cross-checking serial numbers, date codes, and confidential factory documents, the story shifted from rumor to verified history. This wasn't just an old red Mustang. It was the long-lost Shelby GT500 EXP prototype, officially back in the record after being presumed erased for decades. Worth adding, Little Red is also documented as the only GT500 hardtop coupe Shelby American ever built, and the only GT500 factory equipped with dual-quad carburetors. Details that made its authentication even more significant to historians, since no other surviving Shelby matched that exact specification. Little Red and Green Hornet mattered because they tested ideas that wouldn't become mainstream for years. Green Hornet is remembered for independent rear suspension, four-wheel disc brakes, and electronic fuel injection, features that sound modern even by today's standards. Little Red was tied to supercharging, big block performance, and styling experiments that pushed well past what regular production allowed at the time. These weren't minor tweaks. They were attempts to drag the Mustang platform somewhere the market, the budgets, and the lawyers weren't ready for yet. When modern performance Mustangs eventually adopted technology like independent rear suspension decades later, it retroactively made these old Shelby prototypes look less like strange side projects and more like early previews of where the car was always headed. That's exactly why Little Red's rediscovery mattered beyond just the auction world. It pushed back the timeline on when these ideas were first being seriously explored. One of the most important threads in Little Red's story is its connection to the 1968 Mustang California Special. Little Red's styling directly helped inspire that model, bringing a Shelby-influenced look to a much wider Mustang audience than the prototype itself ever reached. That means Little Red wasn't a dead end. Its design DNA made it into production in a different form, even while the original car sat forgotten. That's often how prototypes shape history. They don't always become production cars themselves. Sometimes just a stance, a body treatment, or a styling cue survives and moves into something else entirely. The original disappears, but the idea keeps traveling. People had effectively been seeing echoes of Little Red for decades without knowing the source car was still out there somewhere. Once Little Red was found, the next question was what to actually do with it. And this is where collector car stories usually get complicated. Some purists believe a lost car should stay exactly as found, rust and missing parts and all, because every imperfection is part of the evidence of survival. Restore too aggressively, and you risk erasing the very thing that made the discovery meaningful in the first place. Others argue a car like Little Red deserves to run again. Shelby didn't build cars to sit motionless under gallery lighting. He built them to move. If honoring his spirit is the goal, full restoration makes more sense. Rebuild the engine, recreate the experimental hardware, let people actually hear it run. Craig Jackson and his team chose the harder path. A full, meticulously documented restoration rather than a simple stabilize and preserve approach. That decision mattered because this wasn't a straightforward cosmetic job. The car had been mechanically reconfigured more than once during its working life, so there was no single, simple factory spec to restore it back to. The team essentially had to decide which version of Little Red's evolving history they were bringing back. Before its full restoration was even complete, Little Red made its first public appearance in August 2018. Displayed at the Henry Ford Museum and at Ford's Mustang Alley during the Woodward Dream Cruise, alongside a public call for help piecing together its lost history through crowdsourcing and social media. Then, in January 2020, the fully restored car was unveiled publicly at Barrett-Jackson's Scottsdale auction in Arizona. That reveal was powerful because it finally brought together the two experimental Shelby notchbacks that had shaped so much collector mythology, Little Red and Green Hornet, visible together in restored form for what Jackson himself said was the first time anyone had photographic proof of the two cars side by side. Carroll Shelby's grandson, Aaron Shelby, spoke at the unveiling, adding a direct family connection to the moment. Worth noting, Barrett-Jackson later turned the discovery and restoration into two documentaries, The Hunt for Little Red and The Legend of the Green Hornet, which laid out the research process in detail and are often cited by collectors as one of the more thoroughly documented recovery stories in the hobby. That reveal changed the conversation around Shelby prototypes generally. It proved myths can survive underneath decades of bad information, and that documentation work in the collector world can function almost like an active investigation rather than passive record-keeping. Collectors care about cars like Little Red because it sits at the intersection of rarity, influence, and story. Little Red is the only GT500 coupe Shelby American ever built, one of just two experimental Shelby notchbacks in existence, a prototype directly linked to the California Special styling, a car long presumed destroyed, and a vehicle finally recovered after decades of failed searches. Every part of that adds weight, and its value isn't purely financial. Cars like this are a reminder that automotive history is never fully settled. There are still missing records, forgotten photographs, private collections nobody's cataloged, and cars sitting under decades of weather that might turn out to be far more significant than anyone currently realizes. The Shelby world is one of the most heavily documented corners of car collecting, and Little Red still managed to hide in plain sight for 50 years. So, what do you think? Is Little Red the greatest lost Shelby discovery of all time? Or is there still another forgotten prototype sitting under dust somewhere, waiting for the right person to chase down the right number? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about lost cars, secret prototypes, and the legends hiding inside automotive history, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.